Alright, welcome back to Plastic Models by a Regular Dude and Plastic Models for Beginners, Kit 3, the Revell Messerschmitt ME262A1A. Now where I left off on the last video, beginning to work on the wings. So let us continue on with the wings. Okay, one thing to note when doing the wings is you need to decide if you're going to install the optional weapons. As noted here, optional assembly, open holes for rockets and racks. See step 14. There's 4 holes on each wing that need to be opened up for the rocket platforms. So in this case, I'm not doing the rockets because I'm doing this strictly the fighter, and so I can just skip that step. So just wanted to make a quick note of that before I start gluing this together. Now, as I glue this together, I'm going to do this the same way I do my fuselage, a small section at a time, and also watch for these pins, locating pins, to be too long, because that can happen, and that will give you, it'll make it a little bit harder to make the wings fit together snugly. Okay, so I'm going to do this the same way I did the fuselage. I'm going to start here on this part and run a decent bead of, or a decent amount of cement up through there, hold it together, and just make sure you don't get any on the outside of the wing, because it will leave a gnarly fingerprint and you'll be hating life. You will be unhappy camper. And my suggestion, a lot of times I've seen people use tape to hold parts together. That's fine once you put it together, but it's not a good idea to put it together and then put your cement, because it can bleed underneath this tape and you'll just have a real mess on your hands. So that's another tip of the day. Okay, I'm gonna let that set up for just a minute. Talk a little bit more about the fuselage. I have on this side here already scribed the panel line I wanted to do. From here to this portion here. So that side is done. And I did it the same way I did the nose. I took this piece of photo etch fret, and I just lined it up with the upper line there and just bent it down where it lined up with this panel line here, which you may not be able to see, but there's a panel line right there, and then just taped it in place and scribed it. And if you're thinking this might be kind of a tough thing to do and it might be a little bit beyond your skills, well, don't think that, because these here are the first ones I have ever done in my life. And I'm not saying that to say it's like I'm super dude. I'm just saying that it is not as difficult as one might seem, or one might think. So don't be afraid to give it a try. You might even practice on some spare plastic or something first, but it can be done. So while that piece of wing is gluing, I'm going to go ahead and scribe this other panel line here. Alright, I figured I'd just do another quick demonstration of the method here. I've bent the brass as much as I can to match the contour on the side here. I've got it taped on the bottom for an anchor point, and then I'm holding it in place with my other finger here, and then starting at the point where I want the, don't worry, I know what I'm doing here. I gotta make sure that starting at the point where I want it to start, I lightly drag it. It doesn't take much pressure because you're going to go over it a few times so as not to get all crazy and mess it up. And there are people that'll take some of these old kits and remove every single panel line, and using drawings and measurements they will rescribe everything. That is just, that's some mad skills right there that I do not possess. I might, but I'm just not patient enough. So there it is. There's the panel line. If it's not thick enough, once you've got, you know, your initial line started, you can go over it a little bit more if you want it a little bit deeper and more refined. It's just a matter of being very careful and doing it a little at a time. Now they make special scribing tools, and I'm sure I'll invest in one someday, but for now, for as little as I do, this blade here works fine. And you know, I think I mentioned it before, but make sure you use the back side. You want to scrape a trench out. You don't want to cut the panel line, because if you use the blade as you cut, not only does it split the plastic apart, but it kind of pushes some up, so you end up with like this weird ridge with the groove in the middle. You just want to scrape it out. So let me zoom in a little bit here and see if we can see. Yeah, there's my little panel line. So it just adds a little bit of detail. You can get by without doing it at all. You know, it will be visible even with paint. And then what I do is just gently sand to make sure there's no burr around the edge, because that will show up later if you're not careful. And then very lightly just use the blade again to get the dust out from sanding the edges. And then just use a brush, stiff brush, and get the residual plastic out, the residual dust, and there you go. You got a nice little panel line, very crisp and clean, no caffeine. And if anybody can tell me what that's from, crisp and clean, no caffeine, it's a big attaboy for you. So I'm gonna work a little bit more on centering this thing up and work a little bit. All right, back again. So now I'm going to cement this into place, this gun cover here, and I'm just gonna do that one side at a time so I can make sure it lines up pretty good. And one thing I'm trying to remember about these aircraft, especially these early jets and stuff like that, it's not as, I don't know if their manufacturing process wasn't as sophisticated or what, but they didn't fit together quite as well as stuff nowadays. So if you have just a little bit of gaps or things don't match up just right, don't stress yourself about it. And I would encourage you to look online or wherever you can, whatever sources you can get at photos of aircraft, even period photos. You can see panels don't match up, covers don't line up just right. You know, it's just the nature of it. So, you know, don't get too stressed out if stuff doesn't match exactly perfectly. All right, so this part is dry. So now I'm going to continue on down the line here. I'm going to do my usual method. I'm going to do this side first and just work my way around the wing. And if you get a little bit on the front, don't worry about it, because you want a good weld job on the wing, on the edges, and you're going to be sanding that anyway. So this, it's not going to hurt. And you know, just like normal, if you can get a little bit of that there plastic to ooze out as you're clamping it together, that's even better, because it will give you more surface to sand. So that's looking good. So I'm just going to touch a little bit where this seam is, so I'll make sure that's stuck in good. Now, nice thing about the way this has been molded is you have a pretty good gap right there. Well, that's the flap, so that's, you know, that's a pretty good deal. It's supposed to be like that. So I'm just going to put some cement right there and let it go underneath, and that contact point there, a little pin and such. And it's nice. I mean, these are kind of thick, and you could thin them down if you wanted to, but again, that's getting into more stuff you might not want to mess with. But you can thin these down. Just make sure if you do, you replace any panel lines and stuff. Now, one thing about these wings that is a defect, or not a defect, but is kind of improper for an aircraft sitting on the ground, is this edge right here and this edge right here. These are raised a bit from the aircraft, and that's the way it's supposed to be, because these are slats. And if I'm understanding correctly how slats work, it's when the aircraft is on the ground, they're spring loaded, so these would be protruding out from the wing just a little bit, and helps with lift, gives more surface area for the wing during takeoff and landings. And once the aircraft got up to a certain speed, the pressure from the air would just push those back in up against the wing. So this is correct for a wing in flight, but not for sitting on the ground. But that would be a very major undertaking, and that's a little out of the scope of a beginner's a beginning modeling thing. And that's something, if you mess that up, and you almost need two kits to do it, to make the slats. You cut them off one aircraft, and you know, it's just kind of, it's involved, so we're not going to do that. All right, so that wing is glued together. So now I need to, now this is one thing I'm probably going to have to sand, because the molding on here is not quite up to snuff on this side. As you can see, it's kind of, it's like not enough plastic got into this part of the wing. So this is the flap here, and the upper part of the flap sticks out further. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to glue this together really well, and then I'm going to fill this in, and I'll show you what I'm going to fill it in with in a minute. But in the meantime, I'm going to get all these wing parts glued together, so we can move on. So I'm going to take this piece of tape off, and as you can see, there's a bit of the sprue gate still on there. That's okay, because you know, we're going to be sanding the edge of this, the leading edge of this wing anyway, so that's not going to hurt anything. Just double check, make sure everything fits together right. Fill that in with cement. Let the capillary pull it in, hold it together. Now, as I'm holding this together, another thing to note is whenever the wing, and I'm going to do this before I actually install the wing, but the inside of the gear bay here, and this front bulkhead, or whatever you want to call it here, and this back one here, those need to be painted the same color as this, the RLM 80 or RLM 66. So once I get the wing all glued together and ready to go, then I'm going to be painting that. And then later on, when we paint the rest of the aircraft, we'll just mask that off, and you know, so the external camouflage colors don't get on it, and that will be painted. So that's probably the easiest way. Or, you know, I guess you could put it together first and then tape all the outside color off and spray it, but we'll do it this way and see how it works. Okay, that part of the wing is together. So I'm going to peel this tape off and continue gluing the rest of this wing like I did the other one, and move on. Alright, the wings are I got some clamps on it drying on the flaps. So while that is drying, I'm going to start working on the seams on the spine of this fuselage. Let's see if I can get that under control. Now, something that you want to keep in mind whenever you're doing this stuff, this has had a couple of days to cure, so it's nice and solid like the plastic around it. You want to make sure that you allow plenty of time for curing, because if you don't, it can end up kind of like smearing and not really smoothing out like it should. I know through the magic of YouTube, it looks like this has all magically happened over a short space of time, but this has been over quite a few days, so hate to destroy any of the magic for you, but it's the magic of editing. Now again, some of this stuff, you may not really be able to tell how well it has worked, your smoothing efforts, until after primer has been applied. Remember, don't worry too much on the panel lines, because I'm going to be removing those, and we'll replicate a fresher aircraft that all the putty is intact on all those seams. And in actuality, if you do leave panel lines, these raised panel lines, which would be kind of tough, you know, trying to sand the top, but hey, from the stuff I've read, and this is just some of the stuff I've read, and I could be missing other things, but that is a little more true to life than recessed panel lines like most modern model aircraft come with, because of the overlap. I don't know if it was specific to the jet aircraft or if that's kind of the way it was on everything, but you're going to get all kinds of different opinions and ideas on all that. So I'm just opting to, for a number of reasons, since it's a beginner kit, I'm opting to sand them off so you don't have to worry about, not having the raised panel line there and down there because of cleanup. And, in 1/48 scale, you got to remember that, would you even really see the panel lines on an aircraft this size? So that's just something to think about. Something for me to blab about when I'm trying to clean this up. Okay, this one's pretty clean. Feels really smooth. This is the thumbnail test. It's not catching either way. So I'm going to continue on around here and on the bottom. I've already done that. And work on this and then come back. Alright, more blabbing time. Okay, the fuselage until I get primer on it and double check the fuselage itself is complete as far as filling, sanding, and all that. I think perhaps, yeah, everything's looking good there. Okay, so this is done. This is all glued down. That's all glued down. Everything looks to be in shape, looking like it should. So that part for now is complete. The next part, the wings, still drying. I just did the other flap on this side, and once it's dried up really well and cured properly, then we can start sanding the leading edges of the wings and any seams that might be found. So the next part to work on, part 7, this is the cone part of the exhaust of the engine. Okay, I've already glued this one together, and this is going to need some cleanup because these parts, they're kind of molded in a weird way, and they're just not, they don't fit together like super smooth. So glue them together as straightly as possible, and then use a bit of sanding. Now this is a different sander. I don't even know if I've even talked about having these yet, but these are Ultimate Modeling Product sanders, and the difference between these and the other ones I have, and I'm sure there's other brands and whatever out there, but these are really mushy compared to these more rigid. You know, these have sponge as well, but it's a lot more rigid. And then some of the other ones I have are just like totally rigid altogether. But the thing about these is, you know, some people don't like them, and you have to be careful. And I think they're good for certain things, like this. I mean, I'm trying to sand this small contoured area, and so I don't end up with flat spots. I'm using this, and it kind of sands, it kind of conforms and smashes down all around everything, so it maintains the contour, the conical shape of this and the rounded edges better than just say like a file or a really rigid sander might do. Now, you know, there's plenty of people that can sand this kind of stuff with no problem using those kind of sanders. I just prefer to use one like this so I don't risk any flat spots and any potential aggravation. Okay, so that looks pretty good. That's nice and rounded looking there. So okay, so that's that. So the next part is 84. Let's see, on the ones on the left side, 84, 9, and 10. So we've got 84 and 9 first, and then this parts number 15 and 90, which is this, that can be installed after this is done. So I want to concentrate on doing this first. So the first thing I'm doing is checking to make sure everything lines up okay. Now here is a case where the locating pin is off just ever so slightly, so that's going to make that a little more difficult to line this up. So in order to alleviate that problem, I'm going to completely cut. Well, let's try something here first. If you're really careful, you can try and slice a little bit off. Now, since on this locating pin, and this is probably some unnecessary surgery, and it could probably be handled. Now, I'm going to cut it completely off because it's making this go out of alignment as well. It's got these two pieces kind of like this. Instead of being lined up, they're like this. Okay. They're just a little bit off like this, okay? So the bottom lines up okay, it seems. It just seems that the top locating pin is twisting it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut that off completely. Cut tank, just like that. Make sure it's trimmed completely off and flush. I'm doing it at a little bit of an angle so I don't cut a chunk out of the edge there. And then I'm going to, since this is the side with no locating pin, I'm going to give it just a really quick, very light sand to make sure there's no burrs, no flash that I might not be able to see. And then see how it fits. So we put the bottom locator pin together. That lines up good. And that lines up good. Okay, so that's a little bit better. So what I'm going to do first is, just like on the fuselage, I'm going to do this lower portion first and make sure it is lined up perfectly, or as near to perfect as I can get it. And apply the cement to the inside. Hold it in place, apply it to the inside right here. Okay, and you probably can't see it, but I'm lining it up, making sure it's as close as possible. There's just a little bit of seepage of plastic coming out there, just like I want it, so it'll make it easier to sand. Okay. So that looks pretty good. Okay, looks like I got a good joint there. So I'm going to set that aside, and I'm going to cut the parts off for the other side. Well, I already have actually, but I'm going to clean these up, test fit them, and see if they need to be glued up as well. Now here's that cone part that I was talking about just a minute ago that I had to sand. You know, smaller parts on these older kits can be a bit trickier just because, you know, they're smaller, and the engineering back then just wasn't as precise as it is now. And here's another little tip: when you're cutting on a rounded or curved surface, make sure you don't cut too close, or else you'll end up with a little flat spot or even a little divot, and you don't want that. So it's best to cut off as much as you can. You can even cut it at an angle, like I'm cutting at an angle right here, kind of with the straight edge, and which leaves a little nib sticking out there. And then you can cut that off. That way the majority of the material's gone, but you haven't compromised the curve there. Because once you glue it all together, then you can sand that down. It's easier to sand it down than try and build it back up. So I'm going to glue this together. I'm going to test fit these and glue these together, and then we'll move on with the rest.